And I really appreciate Richard Vague for investing the time and putting himself up for such scrutiny on this issue of trying to get out. But it's already been successful, and I wanted to give some of us an opportunity to have a conversation with Richard about what drove him to do this, what his thinking is, how he sees the world, because I think it's important for us to not just listen to ourselves in this. So please welcome my good friend Richard Vague, who's the author of Terrorism, A Brief for Americans. Richard Vague.
Merci beaucoup. It's a great privilege to be here, and I have greatly appreciated the leadership and assistance that I've gotten from Steve and so many others as I have wrestled with what to me is perhaps the greatest issue of my political lifetime. I have historically been a conservative, but as I look at history, there is nothing intrinsically Republican about war. And in fact, if you look at it, more of America's involvement in wars have come through Democratic leadership. So the very idea that because you're a Republican, you should also be for our war in Iraq didn't strike me as rational and still does not. When the war began, the price of oil was $28 a barrel. It's now $63, $64 a barrel. Interest rates were 450 basis points lower then than they are now. Our deficit, our cumulative deficit as a country, was so close to zero that there was discussion about retiring entire classes of bonds. You know, the 30-year bond itself was in peril of being retired as a class of bonds, the 10-year bond, and others. So the war has had a more structural effect on the economy than I think has yet been given credit. And in fact, the most difficult part of my business career was the years after Vietnam, where the accumulated deficit of that period was a drain on the economy for many, many years. So all that having been said, there are economic reasons to be concerned about that, but there are much bigger reasons, social, moral, and others, to be looking at this issue. So with a lot of folks' help, we have looked deeply into the issue, and our belief is that more, much more, can be accomplished to reduce terrorism, if that's indeed your objective, by building things up rather than tearing them down. In building things up in places like Morocco, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Turkey, and elsewhere. Especially if this building up is accompanied by a resolution, whatever that resolution is, in Palestine. And Palestine is much more central to the issues of global terrorism than is ordinarily given credit. What we instead are doing and continue to do has the effect of increasing terrorism. And that's where we are today. Now, terrorism and terrorists have existed throughout history. In all countries, you know, you get the idea when I talk to kind of everyday folks that it's an Islamic phenomenon. But in fact, it has existed in all historical eras, in essentially all countries, in essentially all religions. And in fact, there have been more occurrences in the period since World War II. There have been more occurrences of terrorism in stable democracies than in any other country. If you look at things like white supremacist acts in the United States, the Red Brigade in Germany, the Red Army faction coming out of World War II in Japan, and the list goes on and on and on. There's a great documentation of this that's been prepared by Eubank and Weinberg that's instructive to read. So terrorism exists more in stable democracies than it does elsewhere. But the influence of those terrorists, be they white supremacists or others, is usually marginalized. It's usually very limited. A terrorist act that occurs somewhere in the United States that's a white supremacist act usually stays very contained and does not get the support of the broad population. So the key question becomes, what is it in these Middle Eastern countries that causes the broader population to respond and support terrorists? And the answer is, as you look at all the instances of terrorism, whether it's over the last 50 years or if you extend back centuries and include Russia in the early 20th century and the Bolshevik Revolution, Napoleon in Spain in the early 1800s, and dozens of other examples, the answer is there are two things that cause a broad population to empathize with and in some cases go so far as to support terrorists: occupation and oppression. A great example of occupation is the occupation of Ireland by England in the 17 and 1800s, which manifested itself so clearly with the IRA and others, splinter groups from that, in the 1900s. A great example of oppression is Peru in the 1960s and 70s, where you had, in essence, a dictatorship, a military dictatorship in that situation. And you had the telltale signs, by the way, of this oppression, corruption, a concentration of wealth in a very few hands. But the commonality between oppression and occupation is, in both cases, the people are deprived of a participation in government. And the basic obligations of government to the governed are not fulfilled. The most central of these always ends up being the enforcement of property rights, but is closely followed by things like safety, education, access to opportunity, and the like. And in the post-industrial age, when the broad population is not allowed to participate in government, does not have enforcement of property rights, the inevitable results are poverty and despair, which are in fact the things that make a population receptive to alternative choices. We shouldn't have wondered, we shouldn't have been surprised when we noted that Hezbollah was building hospitals for the population there. We shouldn't have been surprised when we learned that the Taliban was operating schools in Afghanistan. There was a void, there was a vacuum. And where a vacuum exists, an alternative arises to provide the things that people genuinely need to live their lives. Further examples of occupation include the French in Vietnam in the early part of the 1900s through the 1950s. We already mentioned Napoleon in Spain in the early 19th century, which is where, by the way, the term guerrillas actually comes from. It was the Spanish word for a terrorist. Much that's going on in Latin America, especially during the 19th century. France and Algeria during the 1800s and early 1900s. Oppression examples we've already cited are Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century. Many countries today in the Middle East and Africa fulfill this autocrat, dictator, oppression definition. Now, the issue continues to be a very major issue globally and may be a bigger issue today than it was 50 years ago because there is still so much oppression and occupation throughout the world. The issue has Muslim dimension because of the relative economic status of predominantly Muslim countries. As you dig into it, the statistics are a little startling. In the world today, of the 6.7 billion people in the world today, 1.3 billion of them are Muslim. 45 of the world's 193 countries are predominantly Muslim. And so that alone makes a difference. If there are terrorists in Ireland, if there are terrorists in Northern Ireland, well, the population of Northern Ireland is less than 1 million. If you have terrorists associated with poverty in Muslim countries, it's more visible. I would note, though, that of the 45 countries that are predominantly Muslim, 41 of those 45 are former colonies or subsumed Soviet states. And being a colony, being a former Soviet state, in essence, slows or retards the organic development of leadership within the country. So we shouldn't be surprised at the tenuous state of leadership and the propensity toward autocracies in these countries. And of these 45, 37, by our imperfect count, are still not bona fide democracies. There's a table, there's a chart in one of Niall Ferguson's books. Niall Ferguson does a great job, especially when it comes to kind of going out and ferreting out from primary sources economic data. But he has a chart where it takes the regions of the world and puts them on kind of a democracy index, and the Middle East just pops out because it is so far further down the scale than any other region in the world. Now, I'd make what I would consider to be a crucial additional observation. Because Islamic fundamentalism is so intertwined with what we see in the discussion that occurs, I think it's critical to note that fundamentalism, whether that fundamentalism is Islamic fundamentalism, or whether it's in Judaism, or whether it's Christian fundamentalism, fundamentalism tends to be, throughout history, a reaction to stress and or rapid change in a society. Karen Armstrong has written a book called The Battle for God that is a documentation, if you will, of 500 years' worth of this reality, where you have great stress. And stress can be caused by positive change as well. I mean, I would argue that no society has had as much positive change as the United States has. No country has seen as rapid a change in almost every element of our lives as the United States today. That creates stress. And that has led to this same fundamentalist reaction in our country. But particularly when there is stress created by war or pogroms or other types of oppression, the inevitable reaction is extremes in the case of fundamentalism. And really, as you reflect on it, it's the replacement of uncertainty. It is the introduction of certainty into a context where there is great uncertainty. We were in Morocco. My delightful sister Joanna is here with me today, and she and I and others were in Morocco a couple of years ago when we were taking a tour through one of the mosques. And we were next to a delightful Muslim mother there who was in full abaya, and her what looked like 10-year-old or so daughter was standing next to her in her capri pants with her Madonna t-shirt on. The pace of change in these countries, I mean, the presence of fundamentalism, rather than being evidence of a backslide in these countries, is instead evidence of the fact that they are so rapidly moving forward. So, the best way to address terrorism is by addressing the situations of oppression or occupation. In Peru, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was, as you all know, the Shining Path terrorist group who was regularly blowing up buildings and killing people and initiating military attacks. The Shining Path essentially isn't around today. And one of the biggest parts of the equation in solving the issue was the property rights reform that occurred in Peru. And we had the great pleasure of working with Hernando de Soto, who was one of the real thought leaders in this. I mean, he was sitting there saying, you know, most of the people in this country are poor. Most of them have no ability to own assets. Most of them don't have property right protection. So if some third-party group's coming in and saying, you're oppressed, you don't have ownership of land, and they're throwing a few bombs around, well, maybe they're right. And maybe the solution is to create economic opportunity for those individuals. And in fact, in Peru, it made an enormous difference. And the distribution, by the way, of land, which is so well documented in the works of De Soto and others, really was the equivalent, the distribution of land to individuals who were squatting on that land, shanty towns and the like, was in effect the equivalent of what happened over a period of 100 or 150 years in the United States in the form of our Homestead Acts. It wasn't charitable distribution. It was people who were already living on the land, had already built up businesses or homes or made improvements, and it was entitling them to those improvements. It wasn't charity, it was empowerment. And it was one of the things that drove the creation of a middle class in the United States over the course of a century or more. It was liberating folks to own what they already had, and furthermore, as De Soto points out, to leverage that. He says, in essence, there are $9.3 trillion around the world in these shanty towns that is leverageable for creation of new wealth if it can be legally titled in those individuals' names. Now, this all occurred in conjunction with the nascent movement forward of Peru's democracy. So whether it's in case of oppression or occupation, these things must be replaced by distributed power, by what we would call democracy. And of course, this is what the Bush administration has said. They've said, you know, we need democracy. Democracy is the solution. We agree with that. However, democracy cannot move forward. The distribution or decentralization of power cannot move forward unless it is accompanied by the simultaneous and equally vigorous distribution of economic opportunity. If power is pushed to the edges cannot afford to retain that power unless they have the money to do it. It just re-centralizes. And by the way, democracy, as it has so successfully worked in the United States, is not just people voting. The ingredients of our success are democracy, certainly, but it is the explicit limitation of powers. You know, this is where the Bill of Rights starts to matter. It is the explicit separation of powers. I mean, it's a good thing that one branch of government can't declare war. The founders didn't trust anybody. They didn't want people to be able to act unilaterally. They wanted restrictions in red tape on the ability of government to act. They thought that was a good thing. Thus, the most central question in terrorism isn't how to stop terrorists. It is instead how in these countries to distribute power successfully and distribute economic opportunity successfully across the broad population. Now, in Iraq, one additional minor aside about terrorist groups. One of the things that's important to note when you look at terrorist group, whether it's Hezbollah or whether it's the Egyptian Brotherhood or what have you, what routinely happens in these cases is that there's oppression or occupation and a terrorist group is formed, the IRA in Ireland. At some point in the conflict between that terrorist group and the power in charge, that terrorist group wants to start negotiating or working towards a solution with that power. What happens at that point in time is a splinter group is formed. Some subset of those terrorists say, we don't negotiate with the government. And so you had things like the real IRA, which was a separate terrorist group from the IRA form, or INLA. I think last count there was like 5 or 6 separate, what I would call a splinter terrorist groups that are formed. And every time a splinter group is formed, it is, I mean, you can look at this pattern again and again and again. It is smaller than the original terrorist group, and it is more extreme. And its pronouncements are more extreme, and we should expect that. And so it's difficult for me to sit there on a Sunday morning and watch highly educated folks on a highly regarded Sunday morning talking show talk about how we should be worried that all Muslims want the caliphate reestablished in Spain. And that happened. I'm not fabricating that. Well, that's not what all Muslims want. That's what a splinter group of a splinter group of a splinter group is articulating. What people want is what all of us want. What people want is to be able to hang out with their kids, to love, to succeed, to matter, to have respect. That's what people want. Now in Iraq, we have something that I almost think of as a little bit off topic. But Iraq, I would argue that the issue is simple, and the solution conceptually is simple, although that solution is extremely difficult to execute. We've inadvertently taken sides in a civil war. That's what we did. That's where we are. We inadvertently took sides in a civil war. And I would bet you that the majority of people that are involved in that today don't know that or feel that way about it. In 1919, there were 3 provinces of the vast and multi-centuried Ottoman Empire that happened to be adjacent to each other: Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. Some mid-level, may I use the term bureaucrat? In the British government recommended, well, I'm not going to, recommended that they come together in a single country. And the diversity that we see today that is creating the conflict between Sunni, Shiite, and Kurd was already present. And there were already enough problems by 1920 and then the years after that that Britain was already having to bomb, not having to, resorting to bombing villages in Iraq to overcome that. Fast forward, and what we're emerging from is 30 years, maybe it's longer than that, but at least 30 years of fairly overt oppression of Shiites by Sunnis. And when we say oppression, we mean jailing people, we mean murdering people, we mean assault, we mean systematic exclusion from economic opportunity. Any of us could go examine the data and find that all those things were the case. Now, if we didn't know anything else, and that 30-year period had come to an end, and all the rifles had been taken out of the hands of the Sunnis, and we knew that they were the minority of the country, and we didn't know anything else, what would we expect? I think what we would expect is the 60+% of the country that had been oppressed for the last 30 years would have their day. That corresponds to everything we know about human nature. So now we have the Shiite response. Now we're in a civil war, and there's another study that I would refer you to if you haven't read it already by a gentleman named Chaim Kaufman who's done a comprehensive analysis of ethnic civil wars since World War II. Now, this civil war is only partially ethnic, and Kaufman rank orders civil wars by ethnic and closely behind that religious, and then a myriad reasons underneath that happen to have to do with one military faction going against another or what have you. But for ethnic civil wars, he has documented that they only end one of three ways, or they only conclude one of three ways. One of it is that one side wins completely. The vast majority of the time, one side prevails. The second way is that there's a partition. What I guess more recently has been called a soft partition, where some third party comes in and serves to separate the combatants into neutral corners, not to use a trivial metaphor, but whether it's Azerbaijan, Armenia, whether it's Kosovo and the Dayton Accords, folks come in and mediate by physically separating folks. And the third thing that happens in civil war is they fester. They get submerged and the conflict remains. For us to think in the face of that evidence that these folks can learn to get along together kind of mid-Civil War, kind of on the fly, has no corresponding event out there in the real world. That's why I believe that the idea that's been put forward fairly articulately by Leslie Gelb and Joe Biden and a number of other folks, is the better idea in this case. Now, folks, especially these days and kind of the early days of a presidential campaign, talk about if we leave, it'll be horrible. And yet, and I think there's, all sorts of complexity to this idea, but I would at least introduce the minor idea that those lines look identical to the lines that existed in 1961 and 1962 in Algeria, where the Parisian headlines screamed, "If we leave, chaos will ensue," or United States newspapers in the late 60s and early 70s as it relates to our intervention in Vietnam. Going forward, it seems to us that the very fact that so much hope was pinned to the surge strategy really underscores that people are thinking of Iraq as a military problem, and it is not. We believe that the whole issue must be approached holistically. There are 45 nations that are predominantly Muslim. We believe if you had $1 trillion, some folks estimate this war is going to cost $1 trillion, some folks $2 trillion. If you had $1 trillion, and it were 2002, and somebody said, reduce terrorism, make things better in the Middle East, we would argue that the better deployment of that capital or some subpart of that capital would have been to make things better, move countries like Turkey or Morocco or Indonesia or others forward on these two central issues of decentralization of power and decentralization of economic opportunity. Every success in one of these countries positively influences the other 44 and serves as an example to the other 44. We must build up rather than tear down. Our most powerful weapon is the example we can set, coupled with fundamental decency and fairness. Those are my comments. There's more we could talk about, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Let me, you stand here. Let me grab this. Let me open the